Be ready.
I indicated before, we have some 500 people who are needed to riding outside because they can't get in. We're releasing all reserved seats, letting in enough people to occupy those seats. So bear with us for another 5-6 minutes until we can get that worked out, and then we will begin the program. We didn't anticipate this, although we've had it a few times before. But I guess what we should have done is have 2 sessions. But that would have depended on the rough schedule. We began this lecture series. Tonight is the opening of the fall season of lectures. We began this 9 years ago. The first lecture was held in the little auditorium downstairs that accommodates 75 people. And 250 people showed up. The speaker that evening was Ambassador Yehuda Avner. A few years later, those of you who were here, we launched his book, The Prime Ministers, and well over 1,500 people showed up. And again, we had to lock the door because it was in another room that couldn't accommodate that many people. Those of you who read the book, and particularly those of you who haven't read the book, don't miss seeing the movie. It's extraordinary. I'm sure it will win an Academy Award. I want to briefly tell you about our upcoming lecture series programs for the next number of months. December 28th, for the December program, Professor Daniel Borders, Executive Vice President of the Shalem College and the Shalem Center, will speak on a subject that probably occupied most of the time at the GA conference and at rabbinical and organizational meetings. He will speak on the Pew Report, what it means for Jewry in America, and its implications for Jews in Israel, and they are many. Upcoming lectures include Professor Michael Oren, the former ambassador from Israel to the United States. He will be in conversation with Steve Lind, editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, on his 2 books, America in the Middle East, and a very popular book, a well-written book, The 1967 War. It's a program you will not want to miss. Following that, in the following month, Yossi Klein Halevi, I know many of you know him, have heard him, will be in conversation with David Horowitz, who is the founder and editor-in-chief of the Times of Israel, and they'll talk about his new book, The Dreamers. Those of you who read the Post and the Jewish magazines, you know what a wonderful review that book has gotten. And of course, we have the annual report by the mayor. We've run that program for 5 years, Nir Barakat in conversation with David Horowitz, and now, of course, we'll have it for the next 5 years. Happy that he's been re-elected. For details, go to our website. It's JerusalemGreatSynagogue.com. One word, JerusalemGreatSynagogue.com. On the home page, there's a place to put your email, and you'll get a bulletin every week that tells you about all of the events taking place here. One of the reasons these lectures are so successful is because we have about a dozen of the major organizations that co-sponsor them with us and help us to promote them. For this program, I want to particularly thank Rabbi Avi Berman, Executive Director of the OU of Israel, David London, Director of AACI, who's always supported our programming, and especially, and I mean especially, Matthew Miller. Matthew Miller is the head of Koren, the publisher of Koren Books, who have published most of the Rav's story. He's helped us organize many of these lectures by bringing some of his authors here. and has done an outstanding job. And I want to particularly thank him because he's arranged for a special discount for the books that you'll be able to buy tonight as you leave the auditorium. It'll be downstairs, and the Robbers agreed to sign these books, autograph them. I think these are books that should be found in every Jewish home's bookshelf. I've been asked to make the following announcement by the Rav's office. Please do not tape or video this presentation. It's against the law. It's against halacha. Thanks to Dr. Glassman, we have a professional filming this event. Copies of that CD will be available to anyone who wants them in about 10 days from now. They'll be at the office. All we ask is that you make some contribution to the Lone Soldiers Fund, and we'd be happy to give you the CD. As you know, we sponsor Shabbat dinners for lone soldiers. Lone soldiers are young men and women who leave their homes from all over the country, all over the world, come here, join the IDF, and defend Am Yisrael and Klal Yisrael. The least we owe them is to make them comfortable, and we work very actively in trying to do that with Shabbat dinners and other programs. Rabbi Sacks is no stranger to the Great Synagogue. In fact, a few years ago, he delivered the Jerusalem Address, which again was packed to the gills, a program in cooperation and coordination with International B'nai B'rith. We are hoping that now that he has more time, well, I'm not sure that he does, he'll spend more time talking to the people of Israel who desperately need his advice. But having served the Jewish community of the UK for 22 years, and having reached out to Jews everywhere throughout the world, I think it's time that we know a little bit more about the man. Sir Ian Gainsford has been a friend of the Rav for many, many years, worked with him on numerous initiatives to help the Jewish people. Sir Ian serves on the board of many charities. He's a trustee of the Wilson Family Foundation, the Wall Foundation, and more important, he's a very active trustee of the Jerusalem Great Synagogue. It's a great privilege for me to introduce Sir Ian Gainsford, who will introduce the Rav. Sir Ian.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we once had a student who answered his oral examination question with the words, "God knows." When the examination results were announced, the student was informed that he had failed, but the examiners thought he would be pleased to know that God had passed. I don't want to deify Rabbi the Lord Sacks, but when it comes to a distinguished career in real scholarship, Jonathan Sacks is in a league of very few. So impressive, in fact, that I am well aware of a number of leading universities in the United States, the United Kingdom, and in Israel, who have been competing to attract him in order to bring his scholarship to their centers of learning. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks is a global religious leader, philosopher, author, and moral voice for our time. As a frequent contributor to radio, television, and the press both in Britain and around the world, Jonathan Sacks has been described by former British Prime Minister Tony Blair as truly a towering figure in the intellectual life of the country, who relates the insights of religion to the modern world and retells the story of faith in a compelling way. Born in London in 1948, Jonathan Sacks obtained his first degree in philosophy with first-class honours at Gonville and Caius College, Cambridge, and then followed this with postgraduate studies at New College, Oxford and London University, gaining his PhD degree from King's College, London. He received rabbinic ordination, his smicha, from Jewish College in London and Yeshiva Eitz Chaim in Israel. After being rabbi of the Maharaj Synagogue in London and principal of Jewish College, Rabbi Sacks was appointed to serve as chief rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the Commonwealth in September 1991, demitting office, as you heard, in September of this year after 22 years. He was only the sixth incumbent since the position of chief rabbi was formalized in 1845 by Act of Parliament. Rabbi Sacks is currently Professor of Theology at King's College London, and he has recently also been appointed to be the Professor of Jewish Thought at Yeshiva University in New York and Professor of Judaic Thought at New York University. He holds 16 honorary degrees, including a Doctor of Divinity conferred by the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Lord Carey, to mark his first 10 years in office as Chief Rabbi. In recognition of his work, Rabbi Sacks has been awarded several international awards, including the Jerusalem Prize in 1995, which was for his contribution to diaspora Jewish life. He was knighted by Her Majesty the Queen in 2005 and made a life peer, taking his seat in the House of Lords in October 2009. The author of 24 books, Rabbi Sacks has also published commentaries to the Siddur, the Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Pesach Machzerim, and his most recent book, The Great Partnership, God, Science, and the Search for Meaning, was shortlisted for the National Jewish Book Awards in 2012. It is the Hebrew language version of this book which has just been launched. A number of his books have won literary awards, including the Great Mayor Prize for Religion in 2004 for the Dignity of Difference, and a National Jewish Book Award in 2000 for A Letter in the Scroll. His covenant and conversation commentaries on the Parshat HaShavua are read by thousands of people in Jewish communities throughout the world. Rabbi Sacks is married to Elaine, who has been his helpmate in all his activities, and we are delighted to see her here this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, we are really pleased and honoured to welcome Rabbi Lord Sacks here at the Jerusalem Great Synagogue, and I invite him to address us. Thank you.
Beloved friends, after all that, I think I should quit one and then. Thank you, saying those lovely words. My thanks to the Jerusalem Great Synagogue for hosting this lecture, and especially to Asher Shapiro who made it all possible. My thanks to our wonderful, wonderful publishers, to Matthew Miller and the team at Corin, and especially to Gila Fry. It is an honor and a pleasure to work with you. I say thank you especially to the Great Synagogue itself for what I've just seen. I hadn't seen it before, the permanent memorial that's just been created in memory of two of the most remarkable individuals that Elaine and I have ever met, the late Morris and Vivian Wallace, Zikronam Yivracha, who gave so much to so many, and did so with such tzniut. To me, there were living embodiments of the principle of Kol Makom She'ata Motzeh Gedulah Sha'ata Motzeh Amvatamita. They were great and they were humble, and they cared for small and large alike, and they gave immensely, beyond measure, to Am Yisrael. So the fact that here is a time of memory to them is something for which I thank you, Asher, and the members of the Shul. I wonder if, before I begin my remarks this evening, you might join me in just a moment of tefillah for the people of the Philippines in a great hour of tragedy. And I think we should join our spirits to theirs in prayer. If I could just ask you just very briefly to stand. Misha Barak Chabotenu Abraham Yitzchak Yaakov Uyivarek Yazor Et Anshei HaFilipinim V'yishlach Lahem Ezra L'Nizkakim Mazon L'Ra'evim Mayim Tzmegim Rufuah L'Niftzahim V'cholim V'nechama L'Avenim Mi Shenoten L'Yerev Koach Yitem Kocho לכולם ולאלה שבאו ובאים לתת סיוע ועזרה ורפואה. ומי שרחמיו על כל מעשיו ירחם עליהם ועל כולנו בני אדם ביחד. בילה המוות לנצח, ומחה אלוהים דמעה מעל כל עמים. כן יהי רצון ולומר. Let me begin this evening with my favorite story of all time, and if I've told it to you before, you will know it's true. It was told to me by the man who at the time, sadly is no longer alive, was Regis Professor in Roman Law at Oxford, the late Professor David Dauber, whom I met when I was a student. And he asked me what I was studying, and I said philosophy, and he said, oh dear, 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 dear. It's a terrible thing, philosophy. Give it up immediately. Philosophers are always so up in the air, their heads in the clouds, they're always thinking about metaphysics. They have no idea what's going on in the world. Give it up immediately. Who, he said, is your hero? And I said, well, of course, being a student of philosophy at Cambridge, at that time, there could only be one candidate, Wittgenstein. So he said, I will tell you a story about Wittgenstein that precisely illustrates my point. And he told the following story. Wittgenstein was standing at the Oxford station waiting for the London train, and with him were two of his disciples, Professor Herbert Hart and Elizabeth Anderson, and they were so deeply immersed in metaphysical speculation that they completely failed to notice the train as it came into the station. They were still talking as people were getting on and getting off, and only as it was steaming out of the station did they look up and see the train. And as David Dauber, who still had his Germanic accent, put it, and I can still remember him telling it to me, he said, "Say man!" And then Herbert Hart ran and he heaved himself on board. And Elizabeth Anscombe, an enormous woman, ran and heaved herself on board. And poor Wittgenstein ran, but he could not catch up with the train. And he was left alone on the station, and he looked so sad and forlorn that a lady was moved to come up to him and comfort him and said, "Don't worry, there will be another train in an hour's time." And he looked at her and said, "You don't understand. They came to see me off." I love that story because it tells us, always remember where we are trying to get to. And in the case of Judaism, that question is peculiarly poignant and relevant, because we have been on a journey that began 4,000 years ago when Hashem said, "Open left," and the question is, what is that journey? What is the Jewish destination? What did Hashem have in mind when he first spoke to Abraham and set Jewish history in motion? That question is not easy to answer. And it's not easy to answer because the Torah does not construct philosophical systems. Instead, it tells stories. And therefore, we have to analyze the Jewish story if we are to understand who we are and why and where we are trying to get to. And that is simply what I want to do tonight. Retell the Jewish story to remind ourselves where we are supposed to be going as a people right now in the 21st century. And let us remind ourselves of how that story begins. Because this will turn out to be the Christ. This will turn out to be the real issue. The Torah tells the story of the Jewish people, of Am Yisrael, of Bnei Yisrael. But the Torah does not begin with the Jewish people. It begins with archetypes of humanity as a whole. It tells 4 primary stories. Adam, Chava, Cain, Heaven, Noah, and the flood, Babel and its builders. So the question is, why? Why, if the Torah is about the Jewish people, does it not begin with the Jewish people? Does it not begin with the words love? Is the Torah telling us these stories simply because they happen? Simply because the Torah is a book of history? The answer is clearly no. The Torah is not Herodotus. The Torah is not Thucydides. The Torah is not telling us history merely because it happened. The Torah is not myth either. The Torah is a polemic against myth. The Torah tells us things we need to know in order to get to the Jewish destination. In which case, how are stories like the flood and the Tower of Babel related to the Jewish mission? And that is what we must endeavor to understand if we are not to run rapidly in the wrong direction. The answer seems to be this. Twice, says the Torah, God attempted to establish a relationship with all humanity. Once in the days of Adam, once in the days of Noah, and both failed. They were both based on the same idea, but in different ways. The idea that every human being, every human person, is B'Tselem Elokim. We are told in Bereshit 1, and we are told in Bereshit 9, the second beginning of the human story, Shofet Dam Hadam Ba'adam Dam Yishafek, Ki B'Tselem Elokim Aseh Adam. But these 2 passages are different, and they establish different kinds of relationships between God and humanity, and they fail in a different kind of way. The first relationship was based on ontology, on who we are as individuals, on the fact that each of us is, in our own way, in God's image. The human person is biologically unique. We are the only life form of the 3 million life forms thus far known to science that can think, that can speak, that can communicate, that can envisage a future unlike the past, and then act to bring that future into being. We are the only people who can act in history and change history. All other animals adapt to their environment. Humans alone can change their environment. They can build cities, they can create civilizations. That is what Bereshit 1 means when God says, let us create man in our image and our likeness. But that entire experiment failed. With Adam comes the first sin, with Cain comes the first murder, and then by the generation of the flood, we have an earth, Fatimale Haaretz, filled with violence. The Torah is telling us a story which is the precise anticipation of what the founder of modern political thought, Thomas Hobbes, described in his book Leviathan, the key text of modern political history, as the state of nature in which he described as the war of every man against every man, in which life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The condition of life today in Syria and Somalia and Congo and South Sudan and Yemen and Afghanistan and all too many other parts of the world today. So we can sum up the first chapter of human history as the Torah understands it in two sentences. God creates order and man creates chaos. And the result is the saddest words in all of religious literature. Vayinachem Hashem ki asa et ha'adam ba'aretz. God regretted that he had ever created man on earth. Vayitatseif elobo. And he was pained to his very core. That is the first story. The story that ends in the reign of barbarianism, of man being less than man. The second story begins with Noah after the flood, and it is fundamentally different from the first. This story is not about ontology, it is about covenant. A key word, which is a key word that occurs 7 times in Bereshit 1. The word tov. That appears 7 times in Bereshit 1. What is the word that appears 7 times in Bereshit 9? The word brit. Tov is a property of things, but brit, covenant, is a property of the relationship between people. And that is the difference in the use of the phrase Tzal Elokim. So listen very carefully. When God says in chapter 1, who is B'tzal Elokim? I am B'tzal Elokim. But when God says in chapter 9, Shofet Dam Ha'adam Ba'adam Ba'amoy Shofet B'tzal Elokim Asad Adam, who is in the image of God? Not me, but you, my potential victim. I have to recognize that the other, you are in the image of God. And that is the move from ontology to covenant, from me in myself to me in relation to others. And that was the second kind of order that God tried to create, the one he tried to create after the flood. This too failed. And the story of that failure is told very cryptically in the narrative of the Tower of Babel. And it seems what the Torah is telling us in the Tower of Babel, and of course people like the Netziv understood this, is that the Torah is here describing a very concrete historical phenomenon. We are introduced to Nimrod in the previous chapter, in chapter 10. And Nimrod is almost certainly the Torah's name for the man known to history as Sargon, the first emperor in history, the first creator of an empire when he conquered the Sumerian city-states in the 23rd and 22nd centuries BCE. And the most striking landmarks of those city-states, as you know, were the ziggurats, of which the Tower of Babel, which actually existed, it was known as the Marduk ziggurat, was probably the largest. It had on its inscription, it was known as the house of the platform between heaven and earth. So the Torah's description of it, that is precisely the description of the great Ziggurat Marduk in Bavel. Now, that second story ends in failure too. But it's a different kind of failure. It is a failure not of barbarianism, but of imperialism. And that is conveyed in the Torah in an incredibly subtle way. We read the story superficially, and we read it something like, and all the earth was of one language and a shared vocabulary, and we think that's a kind of utopian time when everyone spoke the same language. However, we forget that in the previous chapter, chapter 10, the Torah has already told us that humanity had already been divided into 70 nations speaking 70 different languages. It follows that the fact that people are all speaking one language in the beginning of the next chapter is that this one language was not a natural phenomenon, it was in fact the first phenomenon of imperialism. Sargon II, we have the archaeological relics in which he says this, says, I conquered many nations and imposed my language on them. And that is what the Torah is describing, the world's first empire, in which one group of people conquers others and imposes its culture and its language on them. And that is not utopian unity, but imperial hegemony. And the Torah refuses to accept imperialism just as it refuses to accept barbarianism. Only then, and when that second order fails, the first order failed by man trying to be less than man, the second by man trying to be more than man, trying to rule over others by force, it is only as a protest against empires that the Torah then begins the human story a third time with God saying to Avraham Avinu, Lech lecha. In other words, the Abrahamic covenant that we live as Jews today is not God's first attempt to establish a relationship with humanity, but the third. Judaism therefore emerges as God's protest against two betrayals of the human condition: lawlessness on the one hand and imperialism on the other. So Judaism, as it emerges in the course of the Mosaic books, is an attempt to create a third alternative, one nation governed by the rule of law, a law that honors the dignity and freedom of all as the image of God, a nation that does not seek to create an empire, but simply seeks to live at peace with its neighbors and promote the covenantal values of tzedek and mishpat v'chesed v'rahmah. And we have to ask why, from God's point of view, was this the right alternative after the first two had failed? And here again, we can only speculate. But my speculation is this: we all know there are two ways of teaching a lesson. One is by universal rules, the other is by specific examples. The first two stories of humanity, God's order with Adam and then with Noah, were based on universal rules. But when they failed, God said, I am going to teach humanity by a specific example. I am going to call on Abraham and Sarah and their children to become an example, a living example of what it is to live as responsive to the call of God. If that is so, then something momentous follows, that Judaism never was meant for Jews alone. Judaism is God's message to the world. Here is my living example of how I want humanity to live in response to my call. And that is the meaning of the phrase that appears in one form or another 5 times in Bereshit, V'nivruchu v'cha kol mishpachot ha'adama v'kol goyei ha'aretz. That is the meaning of Moshe Rabbeinu saying, Hi chochmatchem u'vinatchem le'nei ha'amim. This is your wisdom and understanding in the eyes of the nations. That is what Moshe Rabbeinu means when he says, V'ro kol amei ha'aretz ki shem Hashem nikra lecha. All the nations of the world will see that you are called by God's name. That is the message that echoes through the prophets from Isaiah to Zechariah, and that is why we are Jews. Not just for the sake of the Jewish people alone, but for the sake of God's sovereignty over humanity. And that is the meaning of the key halachic concepts of Kiddush Hashem and Chilul Hashem. We are charged to be Shabri Rea Kadosh Baruch Hu. We are charged, every one of us, to be God's ambassadors down here on earth. And when we succeed, that's a Kiddush Hashem, and when we fail, that's a Chilul Hashem. And that is the Jewish journey. The real question, however, is when did we ever have a chance to reach that destination? During the biblical era, it was quite difficult. Israel was often surrounded by barbarians on the one hand and empires on the other. And the barbarians were the various Amalek in its various guises, and the empires we know, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, and so on. And then came exile, first to Babylon, then to Rome. And that is the exile that the prophet Yechezkel describes repeatedly as the greatest of all forms of Chilul Hashem. Why is exile a Chilul Hashem? Because in Galut, Jews are powerless. And it is as if, Kavayachol, since we are the people of God, as if God himself is powerless. There he is, he can't save his own people. And for that reason, Chazal said in one of the most daring of all their remarks, that when the Jewish people goes into exile, Kadosh Baruch Hu himself sits and weeps. And that reached its absolute depths. In the 1,000 years of European Jewish history, persecution and suffering culminated in the Shoah. And in the midst of the Shoah, in the Warsaw Ghetto, there was a man who sat and taught and wrote, called the Piaget Love. And as he saw his people, as he saw his own family being taken one by one to Treblinka, he wrote his work now known as Eish Kodesh, that God is in his innermost chamber, sitting and weeping at the destruction of his people, and if one tear of God's weeping were to escape and fall to earth, it would destroy the universe. Which is why the creation of the Medina Israel was an event of such immense consequence. Because for the first time in 2,000 years, Jews were returning to their land, recovering their sovereignty, being given the opportunity to create a society according to their deepest ideals, meant the greatest Kiddush Hashem in 2,000 years of Jewish history. And let us be absolutely candid here. Medinat Israel has been a Kiddush Hashem, She'en K'mo. Here, the children of the covenant have taken a barren land and make it bloom again. They've taken the language of the Bible and made it speak again. They've taken a scattered, shattered people and made it live again. The achievements of Israel almost defy belief. I love, personally, that little encounter I had some years ago, when I was chief rabbi. Oh, I can't tell you how much fun it is to be an ex-chief rabbi. I recommend it to him. I used to run around the world a lot. We used to go around the Commonwealth, and of course I used to get around Hong Kong. Wonderful, wonderful Jewish community in Hong Kong. And whenever, in 1997, the Brits had to give it back. So I was always accustomed to go and meet the head of state, wherever it was. So after the end of British rule there, after Chris Patton was the last governor, we went to see Mr. Tung Chee-hwa, the first Beijing appointed chief executive of Hong Kong, who turned out to be an absolutely wonderful man. A big Arab Israel, loved Jews, loved Judaism. He said to me, your people and our people are quite old. We've been around for a long time. He said, our people have been around 5,000 years. Your people have been around 6,000 years. Did I not correct him? He said, what I want to know is, what did your people do for the first 1,000 years before they had kosher Chinese steak laws? I said, Mr. Tung, you know what our people did for the first 1,000 years? They complained about the food. And Mr. Tung said to me, I want to go, and came just a few months later after that visit to Israel to see how to create in Hong Kong, to learn from Israel how to create in Hong Kong a high-tech economy. Now go figure, as soon as I came back to London, I had a breakfast with the Israeli ambassador, and I said, I want you to take a message straight to Mr. Shimon Peres, who was at that time Rosh Hashanah, and tell him the following. He always dreamed that one day Israel would be the Hong Kong of the Middle East. Today I said Hong Kong dreams that maybe one day it will be the Israel of the Far East. This is what Israel has achieved. Its achievements are massive and monumental. I sometimes say, if you were to ask what are the 5 great problems facing humanity in the 21st century, what are they? Number 1, climate change, global warming. Although I have to say in England, we could do with a little global warming. I always say the English weather is HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Aliyah campaign. Second is the growing gap between first world economies and third world economies. Third, in Europe and America, the problem of asylum seekers. Fourth, the problem of terror. And fifth, the problem exemplified by the Arab Spring of bringing democracy to parts of the world that had no tradition. Well, when it comes to global warming and climate change, I think it is worth saying that when every other country in the world has been destroying forests, Israel alone has been planting forests. Israel was the first country to plant trees en masse, even before the word Zionism had been coined. The Kislev Zion were doing just that. Israel was the only country in the world that had more trees at the end of the 20th century than it had at the beginning of the 20th century. In terms of the growing gap between third world and first world economies, Israel is the supreme example of a third world economy that became, in half a century, a cutting-edge first world economy. In terms of asylum seekers, there are only 2 nations in the world built entirely out of asylum seekers: the United States of America and Israel. In Israel, they came the last time I looked up the figures, which was over 10 years ago, from 103 different countries, speaking 82 different languages, usually all at once, and somehow, after that, out of that extraordinary variety, created terror. When the world faces terror, every country in the world that needs to cope with it comes to Israel for advice. It is leading the world by a mile. And as for democracy, in a part of the world that never had it before, not only has Israel created and sustained a democratic society, it has actually created a new form of politics that I call hyper-democracy. So Israel is not just a source of blessing to Am Yisrael. It is a signal of hope to the world. And that is a Kiddush Hashem She'en Kamo. How? However, something happened. Something happened to the Jewish people long ago in 19th century Europe, and we are still suffering the result of it. What happened in 19th century Europe is one of the greatest crises, inward crises, the Jewish people has ever faced. It caught them in an impossible catch-22. On the one hand, European Enlightenment seemed to offer Jews, for the first time, freedom and equality as citizens of the new secular nation-states of Europe. We are now ruled by reason, not by prejudice. All the hatred of the past will go. Jews can become equal citizens. And at that very moment, there was born a phenomenon that later, in 1879, acquired a name. The word anti-Semitism was only coined in 1879. And it said, in effect, Jews to be part of Europe had to cease to be Jews, which eventually became translated as, if they continue to be Jews, they will have to cease to be. That choice, long before the Holocaust, forced Jews to make the following choice. Either become part of Europe and stop being Jews, at least in public, become, as I put it, secular Moranas, people who kept their Jewishness hidden in public, or to stay Jews but stop even thinking about becoming part of society. And at that moment, a great split began, which continues to this day. The Jewish people split into the Jews who became intensely secular, who became intensely assimilated, and the Jews, on the other hand, who stayed intensely religious, but became segregated from the rest of the society, and that caused a rift in Am Yisrael. That rift was never created by Am Yisrael. It was created by the seemingly tolerant but actually viciously anti-Semitic France and Germany and Austria and Hungary and Poland and Russia of the 19th century. And then came the Shoah and still the war. However, strange indeed are the ways of providence. Because it was precisely that division of the Jewish world into two that led to the two great miracles of the post-Holocaust Jewish world. The first was this, that it was those deeply assimilated, highly secularized Jews like Moses Hess, Yehuda Leib-Pinsker, Theodor Herzl, who became the driving force of secular Zionism. It was their secularization that allowed them to develop the freedom of action in the secular world that led eventually to the creation of Medinat Israel, the greatest miracle in its way in 2,000 years of Jewish history. And that came about because of those highly secularized Jews. In the other direction, the Jews who remained intensely religious but deeply segregated, who had lost almost all their numbers in the Shoah, over 90%, all that remained was Udmut Salma'esh, a brand plucked from the burning. Those few survivors, heads of Hasidic movements and heads of yeshivot, created the second one. Not the birth of Medinat Israel, but the rebirth of Tarat Israel, where it had almost seemed to be extinguished. And today, in Israel, in the United States, everywhere you go, you will find that because of that handful of Jews who remain deeply committed and deeply religious, you will find today more Jews learning in yeshiva today than at any time previously in Jewish history, more than the great days of Mir and Panovich and Volozhin, more even than the days of Cyril and Pumbedita that produced the Talmud Bavli. These were two miracles brought about by these two divided groups in the Jewish world. And without that division, we might not have had either. So we thank Hashem for bringing it about, even though Atem chashavtem alai ra'ah, Elokim chashav tov. However, every generation, according to Chazal, has its seekers and its search, has its challenges and its demands. And the challenge of ours is not what it was half a century ago. The challenge of today is quite simple. We know, every one of us knows, one fact above all about Jewish history. 3 times the Jewish people went into Galut. Once in the days of Joseph and his brothers, a second time after Churban by Rishon, a third time after Churban by Sheni, and each time for exactly the same reason. They went into exile in the Bayit Rishon period because Israel, always a tiny country surrounded by massive enemies, needed every element of unity and morale that it could possibly muster if it was divided at all. And when after a mere 3 kings, Shaul, David, and Shlomo, it split into 2, the end was inevitable, however long it took. And so it happened, the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, Churban by Rishon and Galut Bavel. In the Bayit Sheni, so deep were the rifts and the fractures and the factions within the Jewish people that Josephus tells us that the Jews were more intent in besieging Jerusalem on fighting one another than on fighting the Roman army of Vespasian or Titus outside. And it all began with that horrendous phrase of Joseph and his brothers, Lo yachu dabro l'shalom. Brothers unable to speak peaceably with one another. I find it the most extraordinary fact of all history that Jews and Judaism were attacked by the greatest superpowers the world has ever known. Egypt of the pharaohs, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, the medieval empires of Christianity and Islam, all the way to the Third Reich and the Soviet Union. Every one of those superpowers has been consigned to history, and our tiny people can still stand and sing Am Yisrael Chai. There is only one people capable of defeating the Jewish people, and that is the Jewish people. And therefore, our challenge today is to heal that rift somehow. We have a strong secular public. We have a strong religious public. But we have very little connection between them. There is a rare form of cerebral lesion in which the right and left hemispheres of the brain are both intact, but the connecting tissue between them, the corpus callosum, is damaged. And the result is dysfunction of the personality. I think the Jewish people are collectively suffering right now from that kind of cerebral lesion. That is the paradox of our situation today. And of course, not everyone will feel moved to do something about it. But I feel the people in this room today are people who can do something about it. Because here is the paradoxical nature of our situation today. For the first time in 2,000 years, if the truth be told, for the first time in 3,000 years, since the days of David HaMelech and Shlomo HaMelech, we have the opportunity of doing what Hashem wanted us to do from the very word go. To create a society that will be a living example of what it is to be a nation under the sovereignty of God. Respecting every human being as B'Tzalel, constructing a society on the covenantal principles of tzedek, mishpat, chesed, v'rachman. But we can't do that if we are completely divided into those who are engaged in society but disengaged from God and Judaism, and those who are engaged deeply with God but disengaged deeply from society. As if here we had finally arrived at our destination, and most of the Jewish people have forgotten where we were trying to get in the first place. Here we are. God has given us this opportunity. How can we lose it now? This is where we have been traveling to since that first graveyard from inside. We who are alive today carry with us the hopes and dreams of 100 generations of our ancestors. They lived, sometimes they even died, in order to hand on to their children and their children's children the hope that one day they might be where exactly we are today. And we must not let them down, either by abandoning our faith or by enclosing our faith with impenetrable walls. And therefore, hopefully, you who are so more capable than I am, but with you, I've decided to dedicate the rest of my life to trying to bring up a generation of young Jewish leaders who will bring Torah to the world and bring the world to Torah, so that we can reconnect those twin hemispheres of the Jewish brain, so that we can show what it is to take our stand against barbarianism on the one hand and imperialism on the other, and show what it is seeking only to live at peace in our land, what it is to serve God by bringing comfort to the distressed and justice to the oppressed, by developing technology that enhances human dignity, by shaping businesses shaped by moral ideals. No one does this better than the Jewish people. That is why you find so many Jews living their lives as doctors fighting disease, as teachers fighting ignorance, as lawyers fighting injustice, as economists fighting poverty, as therapists fighting depression and despair. How tragic it is that some of us see these things as secular, when they are precisely what it is that Hashem wants us to do, to bring the Shekhinah into the shared spaces of our collective life, so that V'ra'u kol amei ha'aretz ki shem Hashem nikra lo, so that people can see that this is a nation lifted beyond the standards of other nations by being dedicated to honoring the image of God that is in other human beings. I tell you, we must not lose this chance. We must open the hearts of secular Jews to the Torah by giving it to them with absolute unconditional respect and kindness. And we must ask those who are great in Torah to share with us in building a society where the Shekhinah can live and breathe and become visible. In Israel, the Jewish people have come out of Gaza, out of exile, and back home. The time has come to bring Judaism itself out of exile and re-engaged with the world. Perhaps that is a tall order. Perhaps it's an impossible dream. But then, that's what Jews are about. So I end with my other favourite story, which I probably also told you before, but never mind. I enjoy listening to it. That wonderful story of Elie Wiesel. Elie Wiesel said, did you know that there was a time when Sigmund Freud and Theodor Herzl lived in the same street in Vienna? Luckily, he said, they never met. He said, can you imagine what would have happened had they met? Theodor Herzl would have said, I have this dream of a Jewish state. Sigmund Freud would have said, tell me so how long have you been having this dream? Lie down on my couch and I will psychoanalyze you. Sigmund Freud would have cured Herzl of his dreams, and today we would have had no Medinat Yisrael. We are the people who were never cured of our dreams. Let us go out and make this dream come true.
Rabbi Sacks, you so outlined beautifully the fulfillment of the dream that we had to build Eretz Yisrael. But we're not there yet. We have a long way to go. And one of the things that we desperately need is someone to speak about the issues that you're here, to provide the kind of leadership that will allow us to blend the moral with the economic, the real, and so forth. And I know you've got a busy schedule coming up with Yeshiva University and NYU and the UK.
This is cool time.
No. Listen, I retired 20 years ago. I've never been so busy. These things don't happen by themselves. I just want to formally offer this venue to you, because probably one of the most important missions that you can fulfill is to provide this kind of thinking to Am Yisrael, here in Eretz Yisrael.
I promise you we're coming back, and I promise all the 500 people who didn't get in that I'm going to give a speech especially for them, and I promise you that I could not have, none of us could have, a more wonderful place to really see our future than here in Medina, Israel, in Yerushalayim, Eretz, and in this devotion.
One of the services is that Chief Cousin, Chaim Adler, and the choir will appreciate. You'll have a wonderful, inspiring evening. When you leave, please use all of the exit doors. There are some chiyuv